So I want to begin by thanking the university, Azim Premji University, for inviting me. And in particular, I want to thank Amit because I think this has happened in part because I accidentally met him at a wedding, and we've been trying to, not mine, not his, someone else's. It was wonderful chatting with him, and we had a lovely discussion, and he very kindly invited me to come. And we've been trying to do this for about almost a year and a half, so I'm really delighted that this has happened. I also want to thank Arjuna, who it turns out has actually edited a couple of my papers, and so it's wonderful to have all of you here. So I'm going to speak on the economic survey a little bit, but also, if we have the time, to speak a little bit about, I think, what I really care about a lot, which is both the teaching and learning of economics in India in particular. So I hope we'll get time to go through everything. I might skip through some topics, we can always come back to them later. So I don't know how many of you know I don't know how much you know about the economic survey itself, but it is a document that comes out the day before every budget. The day before the budget comes out, the finance minister actually presents this document to Parliament, and it's meant to convey a sense of what has happened in the Indian economy in the year just gone by. And I remember that after my first survey, I was doing one of these events somewhere, and the person moderating it was the finance minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Dr. Hasib Drabu. And so he turned around to me and said, "Arvind, do you know who presented the first economic survey in Parliament?" And I was really embarrassed because an author of a survey is meant to know some basic facts about this, and I didn't know the answer. Maybe I'll throw it open to one guess here. Can anyone possibly guess who presented? I want one of the students to have a go. If someone has, anyone, one guess for who presented the first? It was actually Jawaharlal Nehru. So two things that are interesting about this is that I think this happened in '62 because of the skirmish with China. He was actually acting finance minister, and the finance minister is supposed to present this. And when I heard this, of course, it sort of gave to me or instilled in me a sense of how fantastic this tradition is. It's an old tradition. It goes back to people like Nehru. So you feel like you're a custodian of something quite sacred and important. But I didn't know the answer to that question. So a few months later, I took some members of the Indian Economic Service to see the then president, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who'd spent many, many years in finance. He was finance minister twice. He was Minister of State for Finance. So he knew more about the finance ministry than I ever will know. So in the middle of this, I was a bit cheeky, and then I turned to him and said, "Mr. President, do you know who presented the first economic survey to Parliament?" And he didn't. He didn't know the answer. So I had a good laugh at his expense. But of course, that's... So the economic survey, this is how this year it came out. There are two volumes. Volume 2 is the traditional, looking back, the review of what's happened. And this has been a standard feature of most surveys. Volume 1 is what my team and I have spent a lot of time. This is the volume that has a lot of data, new analysis, ideas for policy. So that's kind of the kind of one of the exciting bits of the survey, but it builds upon a lot of very important information that is contained in volume 2. And also now, for the first time, which I think all of you should know, all the data on all these sectors of the economy, the major pieces of data, are now accessible in Excel form right from 1950 onwards, wherever the data permits. So all of you who should, you have, if you have the time, do go and visit the survey because you have access to the data. What I'm going to do today is to give you a sense of what a survey typically looks like, So I'm going to talk to you about, in volume 1, the first chapter is devoted to an assessment of the current state of the macroeconomy. What are the burning issues? What do we think about macroeconomic policy, interest rates, fiscal policy, all the structural reform policies, how do we assess them? Then, there's a section I'm going to talk about what is the kind of new research and analysis that this survey has done, and also previous surveys. I'll touch upon a few topics. We can discuss the rest in the Q&A. And then, as I said, I want to devote some time to what have my team and I, what have I learned about the teaching, the communication of economics, doing the economic survey. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So this year, the major macro theme of the survey was what we called the decoupling of the Indian economy. So here's, you see, this is India, this is growth rate. You see that in the period before this, which is the first quarter of 2016, India's growth was accelerating, while the other countries were either decelerating, sharply or gently. So this was the first decoupling, but in a positive direction. But then what happened after the first quarter of 2016 was the reverse happened. The second decoupling, but in the other direction. Indian growth started decelerating, and growth in all the other major economies started accelerating. So the big question was, why was this the case? And of course, this doesn't have the most recent data, which will show this is picked up once again. So today, the Indian economy is the fastest growing economy in the world, but I think Turkey has just, overtaken us, So I should be careful about what I say. So the big policy issue was, why did this decoupling take place? And what does it mean about Indian growth going forward? So that was the theme of the macroeconomic section of the survey. And essentially, we tried to explain this in terms of what are the India-specific factors that made India decelerate while the rest of the world accelerated. And we said broadly there were 3 or 4 major factors India-specific. The two ones were the two structural actions, demonetization and GST. Now, when you think about GST, for example, it had the short-term consequence of making some parts of the Indian economy, especially the informal sector, uncompetitive. So it was like a negative supply shock to the economy. And the way it manifested itself was that in the period that the GST began to be implemented, our exports took a temporary decline and imports grew very rapidly. So you can see imports growing very rapidly here and exports decelerating here. Black line is India. And the timing kind of broadly related to GST implementation. But of course, similar effect was felt from demonetization as well, because if you think about demonetization, it was partly a demand shock because cash in the economy came down, therefore transactions come down in the economy, but also it affected sectors like agriculture, which, for example, if you want to plant, if you want to hire labor, you need cash, and if there isn't enough cash, then supply gets affected. So these were two temporary, the temporary effects of certain structural reform actions, which contributed to the temporary decoupling that took place in the Indian economy. So these were two factors. And then the other reason why we argued that Indian economy slowed down was because interest rates, real interest rates, went up very sharply, whereas they went down in the United States and most major economies. So you know that when interest rates go up, there's less consumption, less investment, less credit growth. So that's another effect which tends to drag down the economy. And then when interest rate goes up, it also affects the economy via the exchange rate. So if interest rates are high, capital comes in because it's attractive to invest in India. The exchange rate becomes very strong. As you can see, this is the rupee appreciated 9% since the middle of 2016. And when the rupee appreciates, what happens? Exports become uncompetitive, imports become cheaper, and therefore you get a negative effect on the Indian economy, both because exports come down and the import competing industry also suffers. So these were also actions that temporarily took the economy down. Now, since then, what has happened, of course, and what we argued was that because these were temporary factors, The effects of these are now behind us, and therefore now we can expect the economy to start growing again. And in a sense, that's what's happening. The latest GDP growth number came in very strong, and across the board you see, manufacturing, credit growth, GDP growth, all these things starting to, even investment has started to pick up again. So what we find is that the economy has started picking back again, and so these temporary effects are behind us. And so what we said was that going forward, for the year as a whole, we can expect growth of about 6.75%. And for next year, because the temporary effects of these shocks are behind us, because the world economy is picking up again, because real interest rates are coming down again to some extent, you can see that real interest rates have started to come down again. We argue that going forward, if this year the economy finishes at about 6.75% growth, next year the economy can add another 0.5 percentage point or so. So our forecast for next year is that growth will be between 7 and 7.5%. So broadly, that's what we said was the macroeconomic assessment for the economy. Temporary shocks and other macro shocks, and now those are behind us, and therefore the economy can start to grow back again. Now, one of the things I like to do in this first chapter is to bring new data and new evidence to either clarify or elaborate upon some very pressing policy issues. Now, a big discussion that's going on is, did demonetization and the GST increase the formalization of the economy as was supposed to happen? The government said with demonetization and GST, and one indicator of formalization would be how many more taxpayers we've got in the system. So one of the things we found was that, in fact, and you have to do this carefully, rigorously, and not do kind of simple before-after kind of analysis, a little bit more sophisticated. And what we did find was that post-demonetization GST, there was an increase in new tax filers over and above what would have happened in any case of about 1.8 million individual income tax filers. So that's kind of evidence that this is it had some action in formalizing the economy. Then another pressing issue was, how is the GST doing in terms of revenues? And if you read the commentary, and I'm told that all of you read the Live Mint, or Amit at least forces you to read Live Mint, a lot of confusion about how the GST is doing. Some say it's going up, some say it's not going up, doing very well. And then there are different components of the GST. What the center is collecting, what the state is collecting. Then there's something that the state and the center together collect. It's mind-bogglingly complicated. So what we said here was, look, forget all these categories. Just step back and see the way to analyze how the GST is doing is to look at the total of GST revenues in the first 9-10 months. What was that compared with the taxes that the GST replaced, both for the center and for the states? So you kind of collapse everything, get away from all the noise, and say, this was what the aggregate was before, this is what the aggregate is today. And so we found that if you did that in a clean, simple way, we found that GST, I still think that GST revenues this year has been doing reasonably well, given how it's a new tax, it's a very kind of disruptive tax. It's been growing at about 11 to 12%, which, given the underlying state of the economy, is not too bad. So that's another kind of new piece of evidence we kind of shed on that. There was also a long description of whether the stock market in India, which has kind of shot up very rapidly in the last, I would say, 2 years, is it a bubble? Is it a new normal? Is it irrational exuberance? How does it compare with the run-up in other stock markets? And we had an analysis of that as well. And I think that is also a very kind of interesting thing. Basically, what we said was there was something quite unusual about the Indian run-up in stock prices, because it reflected a one-off shift on the part of savers from from regular bank deposits, from gold, from real estate, into the stock market because the returns on these other assets had come down. So we said, part of it could be a new normal, part of it could be kind of irrational exuberance, so we'll have to wait and see. But the important thing was to try and think through why it had gone up, and always what I like doing is, how does it compare with things in other countries? Because remember, you learn a lot about comparing, doing a lot of kind of over time cross-country comparisons, and then to try and see what's different, what's similar. So this was some of the important new evidence we presented in chapter 1. But then, in addition to chapter 1, the survey has about 8 or 9 additional chapters where there's absolutely new data and new evidence that we've presented. Now, one of the really exciting things about working on the Indian economy is that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've got access to a lot of big data. For example, last year, we got hold of every railway passenger who traveled from every station in India to every station in India for the last 15, 20 years to see how much, reserved, unreserved as well, to see how much migration has taken place. This year, for example, we analyzed all the GST data, and we found some very exciting things. We found, for example, that this is a subject that's of great interest to all policymakers. What is the size of the formal sector in India compared to the informal sector? And we had data on the GST. We have data on the Provident Fund, and data also on this thing called the ESIC, which is the medical insurance. So you put together this data and you find that what we found, in fact, was that the number of people employed in the formal sector, where formality can be defined in 2 ways. You can be formal in terms of being part of paying taxes, or you can be formal in terms of, is Social Security provided to you or not? So there are different, definitions of formalization. And what we found is that the formal sector employment in India outside of agriculture was something like between 35 and 50%, which was much more than what I had thought before we began this exercise. Similarly, I can say it's very exciting. For the first time in India with the GST data, we know which states export how much internationally. We've not known for 70 years. Of course, we know how much India as a whole exports to the rest of the world, but we've not known how each and every state, how much they export. And we found some very interesting things there. For example, states that export more tend to be richer than states that export less. So the whole thing about globalization being good for growth and development is kind of borne out in. See, one of the exciting things about working on India is this, and conceptually, you think of India as one country, which at one level is true, but India is also 29 countries. So if you talk about international trade, you can apply those concepts to the 29 states within India. Each state exporting to another state is also a form of international trade, like it is a form of internal trade. So you learn a lot of lessons about India as a kind of this federal country with so many different entities, and lots of exciting things. For example, as I said, states that export more tend to be richer. Also, we found that for the first time, we have data on trade between states. We have estimates of how much states trade with each other. And again, you find that, India, for example, in the last 10, 15 years, always, articles written about India, all these checkposts between states, how it impedes the movement of goods between states. There's a lot of corruption at the border, and all that may be true. But the interesting thing is that despite that, trade within India is almost as much as trade within other big countries like the United States, Canada, China, Brazil, Australia, and so on. So there's a lot of new things that you can do with the data in India. We had a chapter also on, why are investment and savings slowing down in India? And a number of things we found, but one of the more interesting things we found was that it's much more important to raise investment than it is to raise savings. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the Q&A. But for a long time, development economics has been about, oh, countries are poor because they don't have enough savings. But what we find, and this is something that Danny Roderick and others have found in earlier work, is that growth slowdowns tend to be associated more with investment slowdowns than saving slowdowns. And it has very important policy implications, because if you want to revive growth, the question is, should policy give priority to raising investment or give priority to raising savings? And this says that we should give more priority to raising savings. So that's something that we found as well. I'll skip this. So we had a chapter on climate change. And again, this was possible because thanks to the Indian Meteorological Department, we got data on every station at which temperature and rainfall have been recorded since 1950. So there are about 3,000 to 5,000 stations in India, and every day at these 3,000, 5,000 stations, they measure temperature and they measure rainfall as well. And what we find, this is in map we can show, red means it's becoming hotter. What we find is that India is becoming hotter, drier, and more extreme. You see more episodes of very hot climate, and also many more episodes of extreme rainfall, both too much rainfall and too little rainfall. And so we use this data to analyze what would be the potential impact of climate change on agriculture in the Indian economy, and we find that the results are very stark. We find, for example, that irrigated areas, if you compare the impact on irrigated and unirrigated areas, there's a huge difference. If temperature goes up, it is almost twice the negative impact on unirrigated agriculture as it is on irrigated agriculture. And so, again, very important findings, because it says that we have to increase irrigation more in the economy, but we have to do it in the context of water scarcity. So how do you both increase irrigation, but do so perhaps with less water, is going to be the big agricultural challenge that comes up from climate change. And then, so, I can't show you, but you know the color of this year's survey. It was pink, right? So on social media, the tweet that got the most number of likes and retweets was someone who said, who is this guy? What does he think? Tokenism, patriarchy, shallow. What does he mean by putting a pink cover? This is all nonsense. That tweet got about 1,500 retweets and was the most retweeted of the tweets on the survey. I felt that was a bit unfair, the criticism, because we actually had a whole chapter on gender in India and how much progress have we made on gender issues in India. And I'm told that this has been prescribed as it's on some of your reading lists. But there were many, many interesting findings in this chapter. But one which has caught the attention of a lot of people is what we call sun meta preference. So many years ago, in 1990, Professor Amartya Sen wrote a piece called Missing Women. Of course, he's a very clever man. He's a Bengali, of course, a very clever man. And we wanted to be kind of as smart as him, but I'm not a Bengali, can never match up to him. Essentially what he did a very, it shows you how communication is very important. We all know, everyone knew that the sex ratio at birth for countries like India and China are highly skewed in favor of boys. So what Professor Sen did was to say that the difference between the actual sex ratio at birth and the ideal sex ratio, that tells you kind of the missing women, because that many girls are not born, and they're not born because of selective sex abortion, female infanticide, all those things. And then he came up with this. He said at that point in time there were 100 million missing women, and India accounted for about 40 million of them. So as I said, we wanted to match Professor Sen in terms of cleverness. So we kind of thought hard about this, and there's some very interesting work done by Professor Seema Jayachandran at Northwestern, where she says that it's one thing to look at the sex ratio at birth, but you must also look at the sex ratio of the last child. that actually tells you a lot or gives you additional information. So that got us thinking, and then we then said that maybe there's something more than just missing women. So what my team did was, this is a chart. On the left-hand side, it's sex ratio by birth when the child that's born is not the last one. And on the right is the sex ratio by birth when the child is the last one, i.e. when fertility stops, how many boys to girls are there on average? And the shocking thing is that in India, if people stop at the first child, it's almost guaranteed that they'll be heavily skewed in favor of boys. 1.82 boys for every girl if the first child is the last child. And this is the ideal ratio, almost 1. So if the child is born is the last child, it'll be heavily skewed in favor of boys. But if fertility continues, actually you'll have more girls than boys. So essentially what this shows is that in India, parents adopt fertility stopping rules. So if you have a boy, you stop. If you have a girl, you continue because you want to have boys. That deeper preference for boys is what we call Sun meta preference. And so as Professor Amartya Sen had missing women, we came up with this term of unwanted girls. Unwanted because it's missing women happens because it's active, selective sex abortion, female infanticide. This can happen even if none of these things happen, i.e. even if there's no kind of intrusive, invasion into the fetus, but just this preference for wanting boys leads to this kind of behavior. And we computed that because of these kinds of fertility rules that parents implicitly adopt, there are about 21 unwanted girls in the Indian economy, and I think that's so this has got a lot of attention, and so the question is, what should we do about it? And we have lots of government has taken some measures, but I think it's a much deeper problem. And in the Q&A we can talk about all the things that get done. So we also had a chapter on the ease of doing business and how there's a lot of undecided cases in the economic tribunals and in the courts, and it turns out that the government is one of the biggest litigants in this. So, for example, the government loses about 80% of the tax cases in some form or the other, and yet it relitigates 80% of them. So the government is not able to restrain itself in the tax cases. So the question is why, what can be done about it, what are the consequences of the government behaving in this fashion. So we had a chapter on that as well. We had a chapter on science and technology, which we can talk about later. And let me kind of end by talking about pedagogy and curriculum. But we're in this high-tech city, IT kind of paradise. It reminds me of one of my favorite moments in the last 4 years that I've been here. So, when the constitutional amendment bill to pass the GST, Parliament had to vote on it. There'd been a lot of political negotiation, and essentially when the bill came to Parliament for being voted, it was agreed by both parties that nobody would vote against it and everyone would be for it. So the GST bill was presented, and it turns out that the bill had 7 or 8 votes because it was, you had to vote on several clauses of the constitutional amendment bill. So the first, so we were all sitting in Parliament, historic moment, sitting in the gallery, and there was an excellent debate between, the finance minister and Mr. Chidambaram. They were going at each other. It's all about, of course, theater and drama because everyone had agreed that they would pass the bill. So when the vote came up, I think the speaker said, now it's time to vote. And, all of us looked up at the screens, and it said, 405 to 0. So, unanimously it was passed. Everyone stood up and clapped. Then the second item came up for voting, and everyone looked up and saw 385 to 0. The next thing came up for vote, 420 to 0. So my boss, the finance minister, who has never raised his voice at all, he turned around to his backbenchers, his party people, and said, "Bewakoofon ko vote karna nahi aata hai." because, because they weren't able to press the electronic machines correctly. Sometimes they would press it, sometimes they would not press it, and that's why the vote varied from 385 to 425. So I think all of you should give Parliament some and the MP some lessons on how to use electronic voting machines. So okay, so I want to end with thoughts on pedagogy and curriculum. See, I think, let me just say 3 or 4 things and then I'll stop. I think that after the global financial crisis, economists, the reputation of economists has come into a lot of almost disrepute, I would say, because very few people predicted or anticipated the big global financial crisis that happened in 2008. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, including Raghu and Nouriel Roubini, but even they kind of hinted at this, but nobody quite saw through, what was going to happen. I think also in the last 2-3 years, with Brexit, with the rise of, what's happening in the US, economists have also been blindsided by the fact that there's been this backlash against globalization. Tariffs are being raised, immigration is being, restrictions are being placed, China is, flouting intellectual property rules. So the whole backlash against globalization is not something that I think, because most economists tend to believe that globalization is a very good thing. In fact, Paul Samuelson famously said, the only proposition in economics that is both non-trivial and true is that trade is good for everyone. So it's kind of win-win across countries. But despite that, we've had this backlash against globalization. So I think that the task of economists, I think, has become much more difficult. I think there's been a lot of soul searching that's been going on. And that soul searching, I think, should touch not just academic economists, but also policy economists like us who work in government, and of course the teaching of economics as well. I think all of us have a lot to learn. So what have we learned, doing this survey from this? One thing, of course, we've learned is that, we have to learn to communicate ideas and policy much better. I think that one of the findings we have from behavioral theory is that economists tend to be, too much fact and data driven, whereas the world responds to stories and narratives. So how do you convert facts into stories? It has to be a story to grip the attention, but you can't start spinning bad stories or false stories. So you have to maintain some integrity in terms of the data and the analysis that you do. So how do you do that? So that, I think, is something that's becoming more and more important. In fact, there's a recent study that shows that on Twitter, scientists are much better at communicating than economists. Because economists, they say, we did this, and this went up and this came down, and it's all kind of gets, the flip side of big data is that there's too much data. Your mind can't process all this data. So I think, we have to have some ways of trying to know what is important, what is unimportant, and I think that's something. So I think the effective communication of ideas and policies. So just to give you one example, in last year's economics survey, we had a chapter on universal basic income. And, we were by no means, the economics survey was not the first to talk about universal basic income. Lots of people have spoken about that. But I think, for me, it was very important to try and make that chapter come alive. So one of the ways we did that was to call the chapter Universal Basic Income, a conversation with and within the Mahatma, i.e., what would Mahatma Gandhi have said about universal basic income? So that was a way of trying to make that chapter come alive as well, and I think it's generated a lot of debate. I mean, not everyone agrees with what we said. Lots of people agree, lots of people disagree. But the important thing is that I think that chapter has kind of captured a lot of people's minds and attention, so there's a lot more discussion of that. I think the other thing that I kind of care about deeply is, and I was saying this earlier, how do economists and policymakers and academics, but this applies especially to people in government, how do you both, maintain this independence and objectivity because, you want to be, I call this the Karna versus the Arjuna challenge, which is that Karna was, of course, famously loyal to Duryodhana, even though his mother said, why don't you switch sides and come to the good guys? And he said, no, I have to be loyal to, the people who've kind of devoted so much care and attention. So in that sense, being in government, you have to try and be as supportive of government as possible, to do the best that government wants to do. So that I would call the Karna kind of ethic. But there's also an Arjuna ethic, which is that you also have to be truthful to something broader and bigger, so that people can trust what you say, and so that you're seen as a voice of objectivity and reliability rather than just a kind of spin master for government. So I think that's also very important. It's something that we try and do. Last year we had a chapter on demonetization, which tried to present both sides of the case, and at some point, if you have the time, you should go and read that chapter as well. The other thing, of course, is that more and more, and this is something I was speaking to Amit coming here, that I do think that, by the way, let me just say something very strong. I think that if students don't find something interesting or arresting, course, curriculum, etc., I'm going to go stick my neck out and say it's 100% the fault of the teachers and not of the students. I know Amit may not like what I'm saying, and Arjun may not like what I'm saying. I'm sure they're very good teachers. But I'm saying that I think there is a sense in which I think everything can be made to come alive and be interesting for an audience. And that these days, that means, for example, working a lot with data visualization. I think so much can be done. I think courses and curriculums around the world should be redesigned in a way that I think the subject matter comes alive. The other thing that I think, of course, is that curriculum and curricula and courses should be continually updated, because if I want to make the Indian economy come alive today, I would talk about demonetization and GST. But if I wanted to make you come alive 5 years from now and spoke about demonetization, all of you will say, sir, that was so yesterday, why are we doing this now? So you have to make the curriculum alive, and I think that means that we have to, as teachers, as policymakers, especially teachers, have to make this come alive in ways that I think students can kind of get engaged and so on. One thing I will say, and this is a challenge of teaching and of writing economic surveys in the modern economy, and this is my one criticism of all of you. I don't know any one of you, but I can guarantee you that your attention spans are 1/10 as much as that of your parents. It's a problem for you. It's a problem for our teachers. How do we deal with people like you who are constantly on Twitter and Instagram or whatever that you're on? And I think I have become a Twitter maniac now compared to what I was 5 years ago. So it's not just true of you; it's true for all of us. So in this limited attention span world, how do you make things come alive? For example, I think that I am reaching the limits of your attention span. I need to stop very soon. I can make out. You all want to see what messages you've got from whoever it is. So I need to stop now. But I think that what this means is that we have to now probably give fewer long readings. We have to, I think, Arjun is not going to invite me again ever to Azim Premji University. No, but so if he gives you too many long readings, write to me. I'll try and fix him. But I do think that it's a challenge. It's a fact of life. But for example, and I'll tell you a secret as far as I'm concerned. I learned a lot of international macroeconomics. In fact, I would say a lot of my learning on international macroeconomics came from reading every day Paul Krugman's blog. He used to write a blog much more regularly. I mean, for simplicity, for clarity, for insight, for breadth of coverage, I think nothing could match that. So I think more reliance on these, blogs, whatever, short articles. In fact, I have a reading list. I have a reading list. If you ever have the time, go and check it out. I did a course on economic development, and I have a reading list for both what are the fiction and non-economics, non-fiction that I think we should recommend for students to read. That's one way. But I think that that also that has too many books, I think. So already it's been overtaken by the Twitter world. But I do think we can learn. We need to keep constantly reevaluating how do you learn, therefore how should we teach. And in some ways in the survey, I think we've tried to do that by having, I feel that, when I write an op-ed, the survey should read like an op-ed. In fact, I wouldn't quite go so far as to say that the survey should read like a tweet. That's going too far. But I mean, I think it has to read more and more so that people can access it. But bottom line is that the Indian economy is very exciting. Economic development is very exciting. Economics as a discipline is super exciting. And if you don't feel any of these, I'm going to look at Arjuna and Amit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think what we will do is Arjun will come up here, he'll just join you on stage and get started with maybe a comment or something while we get the questions from the audience organized. So I'm just going to, while you talk, I'm just going to go around and pick out a few people in the audience to whom you can pass your questions. Because whoever is nearest to you, just pass your questions to them, and then we'll collect them, and I'll just do a first quick screening. This is also to ensure that I don't get accused later of picking questions from my favorite people. So I don't know who, don't write your name on it. I'll just pick some good questions, and then we'll take it from there. So why don't you start?
And any question about economics that you want? Yes. Yeah, it doesn't have to be on this. It can be about anything else.
If you read something in the survey that you wanted to ask about, something that...
Yeah, anything, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So since we're in South India, I can say that although we love our Bengali economists, we also love our Tambram economists. So thank you. So thank you, Arvind, for a really wide-ranging talk. And
he just said something politically very incorrect, by the way.
So what I'm going to do is actually just try to model how I'd like the questions to be. I'd like people to ask, basically a question should have the following format. The first sentence should be a question, the second sentence should not exist. Yeah. So maybe I should just begin with asking Arvind, what in your opinion is maybe the greatest economic challenge we are facing? You gave good results, but what's the greatest challenge that you think?
Yeah, I mean, see, in the survey we say that, I think if you would, again, everyone can have his or own, will have his or own list of priorities. But I think the three big challenges that I think we spell out in the survey are: one, employment; two, human capital, by which I mean health and education; and the third is agriculture. So, and it's not in any particular order, but I think these are the three big challenges. And they're challenges for different reasons. I think that we know employment is a challenge because this whole demographic dividend, a kind of rising youth population, and we need to provide opportunities for them. I think employment is also the surest way of boosting people's productivity and incomes. I think human capital, I think more and more health and education is very important because no country becomes really rich if its citizens are not healthy and educated. And agriculture, because in India we have so many people living on agriculture, subject to all these shocks, the weather, climate change, and that I think, and so many people still derive their sustenance from agriculture. So for these reasons, I think these would be the three main challenges, and I forbid you from asking what are the solutions for them. No, listen, I'm joking, of course.
Okay, maybe we can ask one or two questions before they start. Okay, just, you had your hand up. You can just ask quickly one question. Okay.
Happy to see you too. No parochialism anymore. Okay.
I have 2 questions for you.
One, only one. He said only one.
Only one.
Yeah.
I think 10 days ago, Raghuram Rajan said, after 10 or 15 years, lots of people will lose their jobs because they're introducing the robots in every field. So even many people are making statement, robots will replace the teachers in university and schools also. Not only in the service sector, in the industrial sector also. So it's a huge problem how government is going to face this issue.
See, only yesterday, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, released probably one of the, there have been some, but a major study analyzing in detail how many jobs were potentially threatened by automation, robotics, or all of that. Their finding is that for the advanced economies, the potential jobs under threat are much lower than what any people have been estimating. So they are saying, this is all a lot of scaremongering, be careful. However, what they say is that for developing countries, the challenges might be greater because, you see, to pick up on what you said, it's probably very difficult to replace a good teacher. I think a bad teacher, is replaceable. You don't even need a computer to replace a bad teacher or a robot. You just have him go out of the face of the earth or whatever, right? But in the case of low-skill jobs, they're much more at threat. For example, now soft cloth can be cut by robots. What that means is that labor-intensive clothing, which used to be highly labor-intensive, can now be replaced by robots. So in that sense, I think developing countries have to be much more cognizant of this threat and anticipate this threat. And I think what government needs to do is to do many things, but I still think that there is a window of about 10 to 15 to 20 years where some of these labor-intensive activities can still continue. So my own view is that for the next 15, 20 years, we can still try and reclaim some of this low-skill manufacturing like clothing, leather, footwear, etc. And China is vacating the space because it's becoming a high-wage economy. There's an opening for countries like India. And so I think Make in India and other policies should try and get back some of that manufacturing before the threat from robots becomes very real.
Okay. So here are some questions. So the first one is, how are we planning to handle the problem of non-performing assets in the medium to long term?
So I didn't touch upon this in this presentation because I knew one of you was going to ask this question. And look, I think the problems of the banking system are very serious and real. I think that the non-performing asset problem has become serious enough that both investment has been held back, credit growth has been held back. So what needs to be done? I think that, I call this the 4 R's, how to solve this problem. First is recognition that, we first have to come clean about the scale of the problem, how many bad assets there are in the system. The second, which the government has done under the bankruptcy, is that we need resolution. That means that firms that have all these kind of loans, they have to be kind of cleaned up. And that's what the bankruptcy process is trying to do. That's the second R. The third R is that, remember that the non-performing asset problem is actually a twin balance sheet problem. The corporate sector has too much debt, the banking sector has too many bad assets, right? So for the corporate sector, we have the resolution process. For the bank, we need to recapitalize them after cleaning it up. And the government in November had this big package to recapitalize the banks. the problem, I think, is that after these new events have happened, I think we have to review the whole problem, because it seems like we probably have more bad assets than we had earlier thought. And therefore, going forward, we will need to probably put in more money into the banking system. But this is where the fourth R comes in. We need reforms, i.e., if you want to clean up the banking system, we can throw money at it and, of course, clean it up. But how do we prevent the problem from coming back again? And that's where the fundamental reform of the banking system has to happen. And here, I must say, there are 2 or 3 different views on what these fundamental reforms are. My own view is that we need to have much better regulation of both the public and the private sector banks. But we also need to think about having fewer and fewer public sector banks. Now, when I say that, especially on Twitter, I get pushback saying, aha, you want privatization, but look at the private sector banks, they're also in trouble. So now we not only have a PNB problem, we have I can't name other banks, there are also private sector bank problems, right? So my response to that is that whether it's public or private sector banks, we need better regulation. So the regulator, in this case the RBI, not just this, but previous RBIs, have had to, should have probably done a more vigorous job of enforcing the regulation. But the fact that there are problems in private sector banks doesn't, I think, undermine my case for, less public sector ownership, because the number of problems are much greater with public sector banks. With public sector banks, you also have, all kinds of political interference. With public sector banks, you also have, for example, so many restrictions on what public sector managers can do. They can't hire like private sector banks. They can't take decisions because they're subject to more scrutiny than private sector banks. So we need, more reforms. We need better regulation, and that's the way we tackle these challenges going forward.
Okay. How do we address the problem of jobless growth?
Firstly, I think, and I'm being completely honest when I say that I don't know for sure what is happening to the employment situation in India. It's part, and this is something that Amit and Arjuna and all, and the Azim Premji University is doing this terrific project on understanding employment in India. We were just discussing, there are so many different estimates of what's happening to employment that I certainly don't feel for sure whether employment is accelerating sharply or being cut down very sharply, because there are estimates in both directions. But what I would say is that in the mid-2000s, when the economy was booming, 3 sectors did very well in terms of employment creation. The IT sector, and this is of course a Bangalore thing, construction, and agriculture. These 3 sectors, I think, were leading the employment generation in the economy. I think it's fair to say that in the last few years, these sectors have not been as dynamic in employment creation. So I think that whether or not we think there's jobless growth or not, which I'm not sure, we certainly need to create many, many more employment opportunities. Now, if you had to ask me, what they should be, by definition, there can't be any one thing to create employment. You need to do many, many things to create employment. First of all, you need to have a very dynamic economy. The economy has to grow at 8, 9, 10% for there to be, because no economy creates jobs if it's growing at 2, 3%. Certainly not a developing economy. So I think we need to grow very rapidly. But I think in addition, we need to do a lot of maybe sector-specific things. For example, labor-intensive sectors like clothing, leather, footwear, maybe we need to do more for them, especially with, there's a narrow window of opportunity which I just spoke about. But I think above all, we need to focus on, education and building up human capital. Now, a lot of people talk about skill development, My own view is that skill development is actually maybe not as important as people think, because it turns out, if you look at the evidence, 75% of skills in India or Indian manufacturing are created on the job. So if you get people jobs, they will get skill and training. And therefore, to emphasize skill and training first, maybe to put the cart before the horse. But what you certainly need is a workforce that's reasonably healthy and educated, and that's where I think the human capital challenge becomes very important.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to group, there's many good questions, I'll try and group them quickly. These are about financial inclusion. So these are joint questions. You've spoken about the need for financial inclusion in India, and while Jan Dhan accounts are a great first step, these accounts are futile without adequate literacy. Are there other measures and plans to help with financial inclusions? Most of these are rural area focused. How far are we away from solving the challenge of access to credit for the man on the street, drivers, maids, hawkers, etc.?
See, I think that financial inclusion has, at least two parts, right? One is having access to savings vehicles, having access to easy, withdrawal of cash, payments, receiving checks, etc., etc. And then the other side, which is the second part of the question, is how do people, small entrepreneurs and people like this get access to credit? So these are two slightly kind of distinct aspects of financial inclusion. I think that what we call the JAM trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobile, has gone a long way to creating financial inclusion. If you look at Jan Dhan accounts, for example, a lot of accounts were created, but now you also see the number of accounts that are being used has gone up a great extent. I think here the problem on this side is what we call the last mile challenge. How do we ensure, because I think the statistic is that something like the average person in rural India is still about 6 to 7 kilometers away from the closest point financial center. So I think now the next stage is, we're getting small savings banks, we're getting tech banks, we're getting different kinds of financial arrangements, and we also need our business correspondent model to improve quite a bit, so that that 5 to 6 kilometer to the closest point, if the business correspondent model can be made viable, then the business correspondent can take financial instruments to the people quicker and faster. So I think this whole business correspondent, the last mile challenge, I think is a big one. On the other side, the credit side, I actually think that with the GST, we're going to make many more strides in small entrepreneurs getting credit. Now, how will this happen? Now, if you look at the GST data, there are lots and lots of small enterprises who did not have to be registered under the GST. They've chosen voluntarily to do so. Now, one potential collateral benefit from that is, if, for example, small businessmen and really small entrepreneurs, for example, my brother deals with hawkers, and these hawkers now have to be part of the GST. Now, if they can be part of the GST, then the documentation they get from the GST can be provided to the banks so that they can get, because remember that credit is constrained to small people because they don't have any track record or history of being part of the formal system, being able to pay taxes and so on. So if with GST documentation they can produce this and show it to the banks, I think financial inclusion can improve on that score as well. But I really think that this is an area where technology and all these things that are happening are truly revolutionizing financial inclusion. We're not fully there yet, but I think we're on a process where things are improving quite dramatically.
Okay, so 3 related questions on agriculture and the rural sector. So this one is a long one, but I'm just going to try to summarize it. Apparently in chapter 6.6, you quoted Ambedkar about a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-minded and communalism, and that we should stop romanticizing rural India. So the question is, we're not really undertaking this Lewisian transition. Aren't you making agriculture unattractive rather than providing incentives? That's the first question on agriculture and the rural sector. The second question is, could you share any idea about agricultural crop investment to farmers in Telangana state, given your meeting with the Chief Minister? And the final question is quite nicely phrased. You mentioned that states with higher exports are more prosperous. Karnataka and Maharashtra among the top exporters. However, they've seen major farmer crises. In light of this, how has your survey defined prosperity?
Terrific question, all three of them. The first one is Ambedkar, right? See, I think that Ambedkar and Arthur Lewis, I think, were total complements. Arthur Lewis said that economic development always happens by people getting out of agriculture. No country in the world do people become rich by a large fraction remaining in agriculture, for a very simple reason. Levels of productivity in agriculture can never match the formal sectors. And it's levels of productivity that determine wages. So that's, I think, the reason why Arthur Lewis said, development is about getting out of agriculture, but with one very important caveat, that has to happen in the context of rising agricultural productivity. That is, it's both the case that agricultural productivity has to rise rapidly and that people have to get out of agriculture because that's how they become richer in the long run. I think Dr. Ambedkar was onto the Indian social kind of complement to that, which is that, the modern sector is where he felt, all the kind of taboos, the social practices, the access to education, etc., would be better. So I think they're completely, kind of complementary. So very, very clear. We should care a lot about agriculture because, ironically, over time, we want less agriculture and less people in agriculture. So you don't make people rich by forcing them to remain in agriculture under conditions of low productivity. And agriculture always will have lower productivity than other sectors. So that's the first thing. So there's no, I think, contradiction at all. The second question, someone has been following me on Twitter, and the question about Telangana and agriculture. You see, I actually think that what Telangana is trying to do, and what, by the way, Karnataka has also announced, is to kind of provide a universal basic income for all farmers. I think it's a wonderful idea because, you see, what we now try and do, we try and support farmers in many, many different ways, and many of them have not been very efficient and productive. So what they want to do is to give all farmers, based on their land holding, a certain amount of money. So it's like guaranteeing a certain level of income to farmers, and then they can then decide how entrepreneurial they want to be, what they want to invest in, because they will have some basic level of support. So I think it's actually a very good scheme, but I think, and when we had this discussion, we had a very rich discussion, by the way. The question is that whether it's going to be affordable or not. And so if this could be combined with measures to reduce some of the wasteful subsidies, like the fertilizer subsidy or the water subsidy or the power subsidy, then I think you're actually getting rid of a bad and providing a good, which is doubly good. So I think this whole kind of providing a basic income for farmers is actually a terrific idea and provides a kind of basis or platform from which I think better decisions can be made by farmers. The last question, very provocative and good question. See, I think that one has to be a little bit careful here. There's no question that we can define, progress, development, poverty, etc., in many, many ways. So when our research finds that the more you export, the more prosperous you are, it is saying something about the average. That is, the average person in Karnataka and Maharashtra are better off than the average person in, let's say, Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, because they export much less, they are in the middle, they don't have good geographies and so on. But that doesn't mean that everyone in Maharashtra and everyone in Karnataka are going to be better off. There will be sectors that do well, there will be sectors that do better, and so the job of policy is, a policy has to respond to both the averages and to people at the lower end of that average. So it's totally consistent to say you need to export more so that the average person is better off, and to think of policies and programs to support people at the bottom who might be worse off. One way, for example, and the way the two are reinforcing and complementary is to say that, look, if you're richer, the government will have more resources to provide for people at the bottom. You can have more social spending, more welfare schemes, and so on. So it is not at all by saying that these states are better off is in no way inconsistent or rather could coexist with some sections being worse off, but also that the resources that can be provided can in fact make other people who are more vulnerable also better off.
Okay, super wonkish question which deserves its own. How does the recommendation of the Encasing Committee report to abolish the FRBM Act affect the state's role? And in light of Ratan Roy's article arguing against symmetric targets for debt flows and debt stock, do you think the center and the state should have different fiscal deficit targets? You might have to actually explain that.
I think it's. I think that this is a question that whoever's asked that question, we should after this get together for 5 minutes and go through all the details, because I think it'll lose. Okay. So given that we want to focus on the average person and not on the one who's fetishizing about fiscal policy, I think we will skip this question.
Okay. Good. So 4 questions on the economic survey itself. Okay. Can the economic survey be made available in other Indian languages? More broadly, shouldn't economics be taught in other languages? That's part of this. How does the economic survey act as a good for good policy implementation? To what extent do you think there's political influence on the economic survey? And finally, it's a fine line between economics as a descriptive and normative field of study. What do you want to see regarding this for the economic survey?
So I actually need to keep these 4 things in hand so that I don't forget. So the first one, available in other languages. That's a terrific question. By the way, it's available in Hindi already. So now I hear all these southern patriots saying, this is Hindi imperialism. And I might even agree with you, it's in Hindi imperialism. Okay, so I think no, we should try and make it available in other languages, absolutely. I think there's no, but let me say something a bit controversial because it's a very good question. While I think that all government documents, especially the very popular economic survey, should be made available in all languages, there's a little bit of in my own mind, a kind of a tension, right? What I've found traveling around the country is that I find students like you who are super energized, super curious, super bright, but I find that some of you, your English language proficiency is not, as good as it should be. Now, so there are 2 responses to this. One is to say, make it available in these other languages, and I think that's the first thing we should do. But I think a second, maybe it's complementary. I think we actually need to improve, access to English and English language proficiency for one simple reason, which is that, unfortunately, in this day and age, if you want access to this wider world of knowledge and want more opportunities for employment and learning, not knowing English is going to be a serious handicap. So I don't think we should content ourselves just with saying we'll make it available in other languages. I think we also have to do more to improve English language proficiency. Now, In the last 25, 30 years, politicians of all stripes have said native language, native language, native language. I don't know whether I should agree or disagree. But next time a politician comes to you and says native language, native language, native language, stand up and say, sir, madam, which language school do you send your children to? And then you will know the real answer to the hypocrisy of some politicians. Okay, so that's on language. Second language is, question, not language. By the way, I've had to also speak in Hindi, by the way. Yeah? And when they ask me questions in Hindi, I begin by saying, मैं मद्रासी हूँ, फिर भी मैं हिंदी में आपसे जवाब दूंगा. So let me tell you, to what extent do you think there's political influence on economic survey? Look, it's a very good question. I think that the economic survey is a government document. And this is where I spoke about the Karna versus the Arjuna challenge. That on the one hand, it's a government document, but on the other hand, it's also not a government document. How you maintain that balance is really the challenge for the chief economic advisor. That, you know, what do you want to say? How do you want to say it in a way that I think tries to meet both objectives? And so one thing, for example, in my own view on this is that if, for example, I think some government data I don't believe in, I will not use that data. I will not publish that data. So I have to be satisfied that, you know, that whatever I'm putting out can be defended in a kind of court of knowledge or opinion. I think that's why I think that. So even if there's a little bit of, you know, not pressure, but, you know, if government wants you to present it in a certain way, I think it should only be presented in that way if it does not compromise with the core objectivity and truth underlying that. So I think it's the Karna versus the Arjuna challenge writ large. How does economic policy act as a tool for good policy implementation? Look, I think that the economic survey mostly, you know, is about ideas, but sometimes it can also discuss implementation. For example, you know, take the fertilizer subsidy, for example. You know, in some economic surveys, we've actually come up with ideas on how actually to implement them. In other surveys, for example, we actually measure implementation in terms of how fast something has been done or not been done. So while the predominant focus will always have to be on ideas and policy, I think, yes, to some extent, implementation will have to be. You know, Esther Duflo, who is this MIT economist, says that the job of an economist is that of a good plumber. I think that's what plumber, right? That is that to design systems that can work, i.e., how do you make things that are implementable? And here I must say that, you know, new ideas in behavioral theory also come in very handy. So, for example, if you want to have more people, you know, take up pensions, for example, the view is that the default mode should be that you get into a pension scheme, and the default mode should not be that you don't get into a pension scheme. So those kinds of behavioral economics from behavioral insights from behavioral economics can also help implementation. Economics, a fine line between descriptive and normative. I think it's both. It has to be always be both. You have to describe with a view. You have to describe, analyze, in order to come up with policy conclusions and assessments. So there's no kind of contradiction at all. You know, I think both have to be done, and both have to be done. So it's not whether, you know, it's descriptive or normative, but I think the standards of competence and excellence that you strive in both, I think that's what's important. I think you have to do a good job both of description and of prescription as well. The problem with prescription, of course, is that it gets, for a government document, it gets a little bit tricky because you know, someone just said, you know, oh, what about the farmers of Maharashtra and Karnataka? You know, so that was kind of implicit normative stand that we took, which at least some very intelligent person picked up on. So normative thing is going to be unavoidable in anything that we do. I think all we can hope for is that we do the best possible, make sure that we cover all the angles. So one thing that I like to do before writing any survey is to get a lot of feedback on early drafts, get ideas, and test whatever we've done, share some preliminary conclusions with people. So it has to be a kind of document that's defensible intellectually, morally, and also kind of probably also ethically, I think.
Okay, 3 questions on gender. The first one is sort of involved. What rationale does the economic survey follow to compare gender indicators across countries based on their development as opposed to chronological time, given that the survey accounts only for those aspects of development such as income and GDP growth and not account for norms and values that evolve over time that can have causal effects on gender indicators? That's the first question. The second question is, how effective has gender-responsive budgeting been since a decade of its introduction? And the last question, probably simpler, how do you get the data for the sex ratio of the last child?
Yeah, last question is easy. Sex ratio of the last child you can get from the NFHS data and from the DHS data as well. It's very simple. You can actually compute that. The next question is also easy. The second one was on
gender-responsive budgeting.
Yeah, gender-responsive budgeting. The truth is that I have not done any analysis of how effective it's been, so I don't know the answer to that question. The first question is on, look, I think all gender outcomes, I think we have to be clear, right? Development affects gender outcomes affect development. There's no question that it's a two-way process. And development, when we say development affects gender outcomes, we mean development in a broader sense. It's not just economics, but also social norms, mores, culture, practices, and so on. So I don't think the economic survey at all tries to say that it's all only income that determines gender outcomes. I think it's a very complex process. But what we tried to do in the survey was to say that, there is a view, some people hold the view that as incomes improve over time, gender outcomes will improve. And so essentially we take that proposition and try and test that. That doesn't mean that that is the only determinant of gender outcomes, but I think it's an important determinant. And then what we did in the survey was to see how that changed over time with India and how that changed over time in other countries, and then do that kind of comparison. So because all these things are very, very important when we think about, because in some ways you learn a lot by having different benchmarks. When you say, has India improved, it all depends on the benchmark. It's like the economist's wife who turns to the economist and says, honey, do you love me? He says, relative to what? So it's a bit like that. It's relative to what? So if we've improved, have we improved relative to our development? Have we improved more relative to our development than other countries have with respect to their development? So these are the kinds of things that we try to do in the survey. Okay.
Some questions about India in the world. Why have rating agencies not upgraded India's investment rating? They're still at BBB. That's the first question. Second question is, what is the possibility of US trade war on India?
Yeah, so the first question, it is not true. One rating agency did upgrade India to investment grade. Moody's did. And we in the economic survey take credit for it, because in the last survey we said these rating agencies are being very unfair. So we had a box in the survey called Poor Standards. After, the biggest rating agency is Standard & Poor's. So we called it Poor Standards. And we said, we compared how they had rated China and how they rated India. And we tried to shame them into upgrading the rating for India. And lo and behold, 6 months later it happened. So we take full credit for it and nothing to do with government policy. No, but anyway, I'm joking.
Trade war.
Trade war. Trade war. Look, first of all, I think we're at the early stages of actions by the US and by other countries. We still don't know the US has taken some actions against, on steel and some actions against China. Now, we have to wait and see how other countries respond. I think they are, China today, in fact, I was just reading the Financial Times as I was coming in. China, after about a week of saying we will try and accommodate the US, has in fact now announced that it's going to slap tariffs on American agricultural exports. Now, we don't know. Let's see how this kind of plays out. My own expectation is that it should not get too much out of hand, but then we'll have to wait and see. A lot will depend upon the counter reaction by the Chinese. It'll also depend upon other factors like North Korea and so on. But I do think one area where I am a bit worried, which affects the IT sector and Bangalore, which is the actions being taken to make it much more difficult for the H-1B visa, which is going to affect Indian software exports. That I do worry about. I think that, but it's not a kind of trade war. It's something that's more directly that will affect India, and we'll have to see how to respond to that.
So just as a question, Amit had a question. Can you follow up on the, Amit, you want to ask a question about the strong rupee?
Related on the rupee and where it is in terms of the exchange rate.
Yeah, so everyone is always trying to get me into trouble on the rupee. So my own view is that the rupee is kind of too strong. It's been too strong for some time. In the last 4 years, the economy has become uncompetitive by about 20% because of the way the rupee has strengthened. The question is, what can be done about it? I think that for some time our interest rates were too high. That attracted a lot of foreign inflows, which pushed up the rupee. That was one factor. But I think that, I don't know whether you've been taught the international trilemma or not. I think as an economy opens up more and more to foreign capital, I think the economy has less control over its exchange rate. This is just a fact of life. So the question then is, the policy question is that, do you want to become more open to capital inflows? And my own view is that we should be somewhat careful about that, because the more the capital that comes in, the more the exchange rate becomes stronger and our export sectors are affected. But then others would say, but if capital comes in, the cost of financing becomes cheaper. So there's a kind of trade-off between, do you want cheap capital at the expense of a strong currency, or vice versa? And I think different people have different views on it. My own very strong view is that we should tend to have a more competitive currency rather than have cheap financing, but that's not something that's widely accepted necessarily.
Okay, so just 2 last sets, and I know that many of you have given some comments and some questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to get them all, but let's do this one and then a last set. Could you please elaborate on a possible rollout of UBI in India? Would it replace supplemental or supplement other welfare schemes? Does India's lack of infrastructure for people to improve their ability mean that there's simply going to be waste in consumption and leisure activities?
Sorry, what was can you repeat the last bit?
Does India's lack of infrastructure for people to improve their ability mean that UBI would largely go into consumption and leisure activities?
See, I think that on UBI, I would say that we're already seeing some experiments in UBI in terms of the Telangana and Karnataka experiment. Remember that in India, you will never get a truly universal basic income, because I don't think the country will accept checks going to very, very rich people. It's just not going to happen. So I speak of in India as what's realistic and achievable is something that's a quasi-universal basic income. It's not fully universal. You may cover 50, 60, 70% of the population, but you'll never cover all 100%. Now, should it replace all welfare schemes? I want to be very clear that UBI is not a substitute at all for the government having to provide important public goods like infrastructure, health, education, law and order, etc. Nobody is saying that. But it is potentially a substitute for other welfare schemes that are like UBI. For example, should we have fertilizer subsidy? can that finance a UBI? That's, I think, a legitimate question. Do we need a power subsidy and a water subsidy? Do we need Manrega? So I think these are the fine political questions that we need to do, and different states will treat these differently. But I think, as I said already, we are getting experiments in universal basic income, like the Telangana and Karnataka scheme. Now, the last question, I would urge all of you to be very careful in that. That last question about, will it lead to wasteful consumption, etc. I think that's a question that really smacks of elitism. Because, I mean, it's a question that I don't like to answer for one simple reason, is that I don't think I am capable of the empathy of putting myself in the shoes of someone who is really below poverty and say, oh, you're going to get this income, I, sitting here, chief economic advisor, says, you are going to spend it wastefully. Who am I? Am I even capable of making that decision? Do I have the right to make that decision? So when you pose that question, I think you have to be very careful of not making value judgments or things that I frankly don't think any of us are in any business to be making that decision. And that's where I think we should kind of respect, because see, universal basic income says universality and agency. That is, you believe in the right of people to make their own decisions. That's why you give it in the form of a cash transfer. You don't give it in the form of food, fertilizer, etc., because you believe in that ethic value that people should decide for themselves. So if you have that value, then the question posed, I think, is not a fair or a legitimate question. And I'm certainly in no position to answer that.
Okay, to be fair, that editorializing was mine. It just says go largely into consumption.
So you have no business asking that question.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm joking.
So the last three we'll end with questions on economics and pedagogy, which Arvind ended with. I'm not sure how to feel about this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is economics really so easy to understand? You made it so because I'm an engineering student, and now I really think I understand economics so easily. That's the first question.
You should clap for me. I should clap.
As a student of economics and now development studies, I've realized how the economic of history has always been dormant in the syllabi and policies. Does it pose challenges and limit our perception of the economy?
Sorry. I've realized how the economic history of India has always been dormant in. Oh, economic history has been dormant, I see.
Yeah, okay, and then
See, this is a personal kind of preference or whatever, my own bias. I am fascinated by economic history. And I think that therefore, when we learn about Indian economic development, we should learn about Indian economic history, but we should also learn about, kind of the history of economic development more broadly. I have to tell you, let me end with a story on this, which I find.
You have one more question, then we can.
Okay. So let me tell you one of the most, I think, fascinating stories about. So in 1991, when we had, so if I were teaching, India's turn to liberalization, for example, this is how I would begin my class. I would begin by saying, in 1991, we had a crisis. We had a macroeconomic crisis, right? What was that crisis? Essentially, we came to a situation where people who had lent us money had doubts about whether the Indian government would be able to repay that money. So foreign investors, especially those who had made loans to India, were. So that was the panic that gripped Indian policymakers. So what did the Indian policymakers do? And I think this is a story you'll also find in this recent biography of Narasimha Rao, the Half-Lion or whatever. So the Indian policymakers got together and said, look, we cannot afford to default. We cannot afford foreign investors to believe that we're going to default. So what did they do? they flew gold from India to the Bank of England to reassure the foreign investor that we will not default, that we are a country that will honor its obligations, and we will do that. That's a story that all of you know. But there's a twist to that story. When they were deciding what gold to send, some clever bureaucrat said, "Sir, all this smuggled gold that we have, let's send it to Bank of England." But to the credit of the policymaker, he said, if it's gold, it will be 24 karat gold, not smuggled gold, and it was 24 karat gold that was shipped out, not smuggled gold. So it shows that we were really committed to honoring our obligations, and that matters. That matters a lot. That if people think that we will honor our obligations, it will have economic impacts. People will be more willing to lend us money and at cheaper rates because we've built up a reputation for reliability and trustworthiness.
Last question. What made economics exciting to you? Why did you choose this as your career?
Look, I think that a lot of these things is just luck. Luck and circumstance and happenstance. One of Bangalore's most illustrious citizens, he's celebrating his 60th birthday, and I was asked to write a piece on him. This is on Ramchandra Guha, who's my friend. So I said that Ram and I both failed the IAS exam. And had we not failed the IAS exam, things would have been very different. He'd have been a dull bureaucrat, I'd have been a duller bureaucrat, and probably caused harm to the economy. So thank God. So a lot of this is luck, and stuff, and some amount, I think, I discovered this passion, I think, for economics late in life, but I also discovered it by being engaged, by reading a lot, and so that all this matters, but people shouldn't take too much credit for themselves. I think so much of it is beyond your control. I think you must be humble enough to recognize that, but for the rest, just get on with it.
Okay, thank you, Arvind. Thanks, man.